morning, everyone, or afternoon, as the tolling chapel bells are telling me. It is now 12 noon. Welcome to our latest edition of the virtual version of our Art in Focus program. For those of you who may not have joined an event like this before, at the Fairfield University Art Museum, once a month, we meet in the galleries at 11 a.m. in person to gather around a work of art, in which case today's work of art is directly in front of you as you enter our show Out of the Kress Vaults, Women in Sacred Renaissance Painting. And then at 12 noon, I scamper up here to a conference room to engage in the same conversation virtually with those who may not be able to join us in person. If you are in the Connecticut area and you're interested in seeing our exhibition, which is borrowing Kress paintings from collections around the United States in a show that was co-curated by Fairfield University students, you have exactly 1 month from today. The show will close on Saturday, December 17th. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you're in the area and you can join us, we will be delighted to see you. But even if you cannot come in person, you can join an event like this. So today's Art in Focus object is this painting by a pair of painters, brothers from the city of Ferrara in northeastern Italy, Battista Dossi and Dosso Dossi. Their Flight into Egypt painting, which dates somewhere between 1520 to 1530, and it is graciously on loan to us from the Lowe Art Museum at the University of Miami. And I should mention that the director of the Lowe Art Museum was the founding director of our museum, Jill Dupe. So we're delighted to have that connection going between our two museums. As always, I welcome you to jump into the quick live chat and drop any questions, any observations that you may have, and our wonderful producer will pass them along to me. And at least one individual who is a longtime watcher knew she would not be able to attend even the virtual lecture, so she made sure to email me her questions and comments ahead of time. So Janet, I will be referring to those as we move forward, and you're always welcome to do that with any of our Art in Focus events. So this painting, I showed a moment ago the image of where this is in the Bellarmine Hall Galleries. It's right as you walk in and walk down a short flight of stairs. And I was telling our in-person group that when we were installing this exhibition, we actually didn't realize that this painting was going to be the crowd favorite that it has become. And we chose it in the sort of on-center placement with the door because we thought it was sort of this dramatic and attractive painting. But it's been interesting to see how community members, how students, my own students, interact with this. And it has become one of the ones that people stop and talk about the most. My Renaissance art history students, in choosing one object out of this show to write a one-page visual analysis exercise, more than half of them chose this painting. So I wonder if, as you're seeing it on screen, if anything is standing out to you, that might be a reason why people have been drawn to it, why people are intrigued by it. And having just spent half an hour sitting in a semicircle with a group of folks who did make a lot of comments, I certainly have come prepared and armed and have had quite a long time to think about this painting. But what's fun is always in looking at something for an extended period of time, or in quite literally changing one's point of view. Because I'm going to go back one slide. I was seated in a chair that was located to the lower left corner of the painting, sort of looking up at it at an angle. And I said to the assembled group, that is not a perspective I have been enjoying for the 2 months that this has been on view so far. Usually I'm standing there looking at it. And I was, in fact, able to see some things about the painting that I hadn't quite noticed previously. But more on that to come. Before we even get into a sense of what it is we're looking at in terms of content, this is a fantastic painting because it has so much to offer, even if you have no frame of reference for its title, Flight into Egypt. So we have putting together a show that is focused on women in sacred Renaissance painting. All of the subject matter is Christian. And yet we didn't assume that anyone walking into the gallery would necessarily have a background in Christianity and seeing images of Christian narratives. And this is a painting that even if you didn't know what the story is about, there are so many things you can draw out of it. And one of the things that stands up to me the most is just the tempestuous nature of the landscape setting in which we find ourselves. Even before, I would say, before I look at the figures, I'm drawn to the background. I'm drawn to the leaves of the trees blowing in an invisible breeze. Something that was pointed out by, has been pointed out by many people in the exhibition is on the left-hand side, this palm tree draws our eye, even though it is green amid a sea of green. because it has these very large red areas that harmonize with the red on Joseph's animal, for one thing, but also draws our eyes into that wooded background and then gives us a sense that something different is happening here. First of all, it's a palm tree, which might give us associations of sort of exotic, far-flung locales, but it is not a palm tree that is static. It is one that is clearly being blown by a breeze. And Jane comments, so lovely to see Joseph being given a prominent role in carrying his stepson, the baby Jesus. And funny you should mention that, Jane, because Janet, who I mentioned is a longtime viewer, that was one of the things she wanted to comment. She had made that comment in reference to a previous Art in Focus, the El Greco Holy Family. And she said, so commonly, Joseph is kind of pushed to the side. And here he is quite literally in the center of the composition and carrying the infant Jesus. And behind him is at this tempestuous scene, the landscape being animated by some kind of wind. A member of the group who was looking at this in person noted something that I hadn't seen before. And as I mentioned, my physical location helped me see it better. She pointed out that the tree that is all the way to the left-hand side of the composition, that its leaves and branches seem to be blown to the left, while the palm tree is clearly being blown to the right. And she said it gave this impression of it's not just one breeze in one direction, it's sort of a maelstrom of breezes blowing the leaves in multiple directions. And moving further into the background, we see that this tempestuousness continues in the sky. There are these dark, very dark gray, turbulent clouds hovering overhead. And maybe there's a storm that's moving away. Maybe it's coming toward us. Certainly, the animation of the leaves closer to us suggests that we're at least on the fringes of something. But it is the question of, it's not raining. And it seems that in the distant background, there's a city by water that has light shining on it. Its buildings are glowing white in some sort of exposure to light. And that might draw our eye upward to this very curious sort of geological element in the background. One of our visitors downstairs said, oh, it's the city on the hill that's mentioned in the Bible. And I was like, well, there's a city on the ground as well, but certainly there seem to be buildings on that hill. But the hill itself is very clearly divided into two parts. There's a valley delineated by shadow between them. And it's one of these curious things that, of course, immediately we notice it because the artist wanted us to notice it. How do we know that the Dossi brothers wanted our eyes to go there? Well, you could say that even if we looked at the left-hand side of the canvas first, I shouldn't say canvas, this is painted on wood, left-hand side of the composition, the blowing of that palm tree might move our eyes horizontally across the surface of the painting. But really, it's the contrast of light and dark. It's the fact that whatever is on that mountaintop, that double twin mountaintop, is lit up in white and then framed against a dark background. Of course, our eyes go there. And we have questions about, what is that place? Is that a place they're heading toward, these people who are closer to us? Is that a place in the background? And as Jane just commented, bringing the context of what it is, who it is we are looking at, these figures in the foreground that are closest to us. We have two individuals, two adults who are riding on animals. One of my students, in talking about this with my class, said, yeah, they're kind of on weird horses. And we all sort of laugh because, if you haven't seen a donkey, if you don't have that kind of context, all you're seeing is some sort of quadruped. And your mind will fill in with what you have readily available, which might be a horse. But in fact, if you've seen a barnyard donkey before, those do look like donkeys. And similarly, if you have a context for an image like this, you may, like Jane, immediately have jumped to flight into Egypt. That's got to be St. Joseph. That has to be the infant Jesus. And this woman on the second donkey, it must be Mary. And although we are in 2022, we have the total freedom to walk up to an art object like this in a museum. And if we only want to think about the background, if we only want to appreciate that interplay of colors, of blues and dark greens, we can do that. And we don't have to think about the content at all if we don't choose to. We may not have it at our fingertips, depending on our own background. But I always encourage people to remember that the painting itself, the Dossi brothers, in conceiving it and creating it, they're making assumptions about who we are and what knowledge we have access to. And they're assuming that we, like Jane, will immediately be able to make a connection between, not even having the title, but just seeing, oh, the man and the woman on the donkeys of the baby, a biblical narrative that they are assuming that we will know well, something that will be very familiar to us. Jane comments, for Bible scholars, we see the first mountain as Christ's first advent. We are currently in the valley, the gap of the dispensation of grace, before Christ's second advent, the second mountain when he sets up his kingdom on earth. Oh, that is a fantastic way to think about that unique formation in the background. That's great. I had never considered it in that light before. I conceived the sort of city on the mountain, sort of an illusion that is brought up in the Christian Bible, but that is a wonderful extra layer of depth that shows what painters can leave in a painting for us to think about. In the case of what is the actual source material for this narrative that comes from the Christian story that we are looking at, it's actually very short. Let me advance my slide here. We have in the Gospel of Matthew the quote, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he rose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. It's interesting to think about the Dossi brothers, these painters at the court of Ferrara. They, like so many other Renaissance artists, would have been familiar with the text on which their story is based. But as you can see, there's not that much detail there. There's not a sense of, do we have to show this taking place in a certain type of setting? Do we have to show the weather being tempestuous? I will point out that it does say he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, which is interesting because if you are a scholar of Renaissance art, as I am, and you have seen many depictions of the flight into Egypt, or its closely related subject, the rest on the flight into Egypt, it was often an opportunity for artists to have a beautiful landscape setting. And often the skies are sunny, it is daytime, it's 72 degrees, there's happy little animals hopping about, there's little still life scenes everywhere. I think I actually put one of these in here. Hold on, I will come back to these details. There we go. Put things out of order. I'm just giving you as an example on the right, a painting at the National Gallery of Art. That is what I often think of when I hear, Flight into Egypt. It's another Italian painting from about a decade and a half earlier, but you note that that is not nighttime. There are blue skies, that we do have these sort of put upon looking donkeys, but it was a very common type of scene. But the Dossi brothers have decided to give it the sense of drama, the sense of urgency, simply by putting that tempestuous sky, by animating the leaves. I think it's a really interesting choice. And it's a good reminder that artists and consumers of art, yes, you are repeating the same stories. You are using it as an opportunity for these Christian viewers to focus their religious devotion. For someone who might not have been literate, these paintings were referred to as the Bible of the unlettered, a way to share stories, reinforce the Christian narrative that you have heard. But at a certain level, you have to imagine that artists are going to want to experiment. They're going to want to make it interesting. And maybe that is something as subtle as changing the background, changing the sort of climatic conditions that we're seeing. But it also could be something like what Jane pointed out. Could you insert ambiguous details that could invite a more learned viewer to inject more of what they know about the Christian narrative into what you're seeing? Can you keep people interested in an object that it's always good to remember in a museum? We can look at this for 3 seconds. We can look at it for 5 minutes. But its original owner would have lived with this. This is of a size, a relatively small scale, probably from someone's home. So can imagine a consumer, an owner, who has this in their house to look at day after day, year after year. And of course, it would benefit you if the artist has given you something to sort of continually be interested in. So bringing up a detail just of those central figures, I want to make reference to something that Jane, I mentioned, is a longtime, Janet, excuse me, longtime watcher. And she refers to Mary seems to have a somewhat bossy expression, as she seems to admonish Joseph, who seems to look guilty. He often looks out of place, not included in the Madonna and baby paintings, which is very unfair. And as Jane, another commenter, had already said, here we have Joseph. He's getting pride of place. He is center stage. I'll also point out that you might notice that there are a couple of differences in terms of, I said, the more common depiction of the flight into Egypt. Joseph is almost never shown on his own donkey. He is almost always depicted leading the donkey with Mary holding Jesus on it. So here we have Joseph, he has his own animal, and he is the one holding the Christ child. And you might also notice that that baby is not sort of just swaddling, he's not holding him directly, but rather the child is in quite an elaborate cradle. And in the group downstairs, there was some animated discussion over how long a period of time has passed since Mary had given birth. How far postpartum is she? How large should that child actually be? And certainly it does not seem like a newborn. It's not terribly small. But it's interesting to really think about the logistics. That's a pretty big cradle that Joseph is managing to carry on his lap. You might notice that he's actually rather tenderly tucked part of his brown cloak over the end of that cradle. And the child certainly looks like they're having a great time. The baby looks like it's asleep. Someone pointed out that, well, it would make sense for Joseph to have a wooden cradle because he was a carpenter in sort of the popular understanding. He's shown as an older man, which again followed on an understanding that he was a man of more advanced age who marries the very young Virgin Mary, who is pregnant at the time of their marriage, and he asks no questions. So I think Jane in her comment had referred to him as the stepfather of the child that he's carrying. So more unusual choices. And I see that Jane has made another comment. Has anyone commented on the sack that Mary's carrying? It may contain the gifts from the Magi that will be used to fund their stay in Egypt. So folks, I promise that Jane is not a plant in the audience. It's like feeding me the good ideas. That is another great observation. No one has, to my knowledge so far, commented on what is in the sack. I think the gifts of the Magi is a great connection to make. Is there anything that the painters have made explicit? No. And you well imagine that they could have, right? There could have just been a little bit of gold peeking out the top of that sack, but there's nothing. And maybe that matches, the sense of urgency, the fact that this is a flight in fear that Herod is killing all of the young male Jewish children and that they need to flee. They have been warned by the angel. Because one of the group downstairs had commented that their clothes are very plain, and that they are not really dressed in any kind of finery. And this person had commented, well, it makes them seem like the poor peasants that they really were. I think that's absolutely makes complete sense. And then I also pointed out, if you are trying to flee from the government might be trying to kill your child in this case, traveling incognito would make a lot of sense, right? You wouldn't want to be showing a lot of finery. So if you have gold, frankincense, and myrrh, it would make sense to conceal it in a sack. But again, that is completely left up to our own imagination. You can see other of the flight into Egypt where occasionally there's a basket, there's a cask of wine. I've seen one where there's a chicken, which is pretty great. I think the chicken is alive, but sort of sense of provisions for the journey. Let's try to move forward here. Actually, before I move forward, it's easiest perhaps to see it in this little detail. And behind, if we look into the middle ground, we can see that there's a green slope sort of Joseph's to the right of Joseph's shoulder. You're seeing a little bit of the blue of the water and that distant white city. And you might be able to make out that there are very small figures depicted standing on that hill. And in terms of thinking about setting this in an Egyptian context, the flight into Egypt, there's nothing so obvious given to us by the painters as, for example, a pyramid, which occasionally was a device that a painter might use to tell you, we're in Egypt now. There is the palm tree. But you might also be able to make out that even though they are just very hastily sketched in with a few brushstrokes, it certainly does appear that those are dark-skinned individuals who are wearing, at least the two on the left, turbans. And there are more figures of that type that are over here at the right, gathered around those buildings, which also could be figures wearing turbans. Again, I don't think that's anything that's meant to be definite. I think it's meant to invite you to make that kind of connection. And we certainly can say that nothing about this, well, certainly the distant landscape, the seaside city and the cities on a hill, that doesn't really look like an Italian area. It certainly does not look like Ferrara, if anyone has visited northeastern Italy. It doesn't really look like Egypt either, but it sets it off as something a little bit different. So that would fit the general expectation, because of course, the people who are viewing this in Ferrara in the 16th century, well, they haven't been to Egypt either. So who's to say that doesn't look like Alexandria or some other, to them, very far away and exotic place? Oh, and there's our comparison again, looking to see Mary's not holding anything in that case. Her donkey looks rather sad, as the donkey does in the Dossi painting. Nope, I've gone too far. Trying to go backwards. There we go. I wanted to, well, point out a couple of things that we discussed in our session downstairs. So Janet, who emailed me her comments, said that Mary looks bossy. And indeed, there is something connecting the two figures in the foreground, and that is the fact that she's leaning forward on her donkey, on which she is seated side saddle. She has her arms stretched out and her fingers pointing, and Joseph has turned back to engage with her. And the question, of course, is to what is she pointing? And what are these two people saying to each other? What is this married couple saying to each other? And very commonly, we will have visitors in the gallery who are joking, make some comment about she's telling him to ask for directions. She's saying we're lost. She's saying don't drop the baby, or giving some other childcare motif. But it could also be that her figure is pointed or is dropping down a little bit, right? It's not across, it's down. And maybe if we follow that line of sight, it actually goes past the child. And if we continue past the head of the donkey, you might see that there appears to be something blocking their path. A turnstile, some sort of a barrier across the road made of wood. And what that is, it's another thing that's left very ambiguous. It's really not easy to make out exactly what we're seeing. And certainly it does not appear in the story, right? We're seeing the whole story over there to the right. It doesn't say anything about, they were riding on the road with a donkey and suddenly something happened to block the way. But if the overall impact that these two artists are going for is drama, wouldn't introducing a stumbling block that would add a certain level of drama? What will they do? Will they have to turn around? Are they in further danger now? And a fantastic observation that was made by someone who was with us downstairs, she said, well, maybe it's that the road just ends. And it's interesting, we can see the path of the road on the other side of the turnstile. Immediately, one of the things I noticed from my seated position down in the gallery is just where the road ends on the other side of the turnstile. If you look very closely, and let's see, do I have that detail? Does it include that area? It does not. It looks like there's water there. So it looks like to the, above the road, between the road and that little hamlet, there are these white brushstrokes that do look like the rippling of a current. And then we wondered, okay, is there a stream on the other side of the road? Could the road be washed out? Is that the equivalent of sort of a construction zone, proceed at your own risk? And someone else wondered if directly before that turnstile, there's just a very dark, ambiguous undergrowth, and she thought she saw what would be a path, sort of an unofficial road, as if turn off here, and that road would lead more directly to that clump of buildings we're seeing there in the middle ground. Again, it's so unclear, it's ambiguous. And that could very much be the painters keeping us interested. We have something to discuss. And certainly we had a great conversation downstairs trying to figure out if these little clues, what do they mean? But we can imagine that the owners could have equally the same kind of discussion and debate about an object like this one. So I realized it because, of course, I go in the wrong direction with my slideshows a lot of the time, and I've wound up on my provenance slide. So this painting is one of many belonging to the Kress Foundation. So I said our temporary exhibition is all made up of artworks that were once part of the collection belonging to Samuel H. Kress, early 20th century dime store magnate and art collector, and then later his foundation. And it's always worth wondering, and art historians always do, about how much we know about the history of individual objects before they entered that collection, before they wound up where they are now, which is from the gift of the Kress Foundation to the Lowe Museum at the University of Miami. And that information, which is available both at the Kress Foundation's website, as well as at the University of Miami's website, at the Lowe Museum's website, you'll notice that it starts only in the 19th century. So the earliest known owner of the Dossi painting is Count Giovanni Battista Constabile in Ferrara in 1838. So if this painting is dated somewhere between 1520 and 1530, that means we have a full 3 centuries where we simply don't have any firm documentation of who owned it. It also means that we don't know who the original patron was, who paid the Dossi brothers to paint the flight into Egypt at a size that would have made it very congenial for someone's home. One of the guesses that we might be able to make is that it might have been for a relatively elite patron, only guessing based off the fact that the Dossi brothers did work for the ducal court of Ferrara, but we really can't be sure. What's interesting to me is that Count Giovanni Battista here, he was a count in Ferrara. So when this painting resurfaces, at least with a securely documented date, it's still in the city for which it was created. So we can kind of assume, with relative security, that in that 3 centuries, it was at least in the same city for which it had been made. And then, as you can see, it bounces around in a couple of sales until it is finally sold to the Kress Foundation in 1948. But that's very common for paintings, all Renaissance paintings, but especially ones in the Kress collection. Many of them don't have a provenance that goes back longer than the late 19th or sometimes early 20th centuries. We have a few comments, and I appreciate all of you staying around despite our technological difficulties. So Frank comments, when you see a city in the background, it usually indicates where the travelers have come from. In this case, the dark sky and wind brings to mind the massacre of the innocents. I think that's absolutely true in terms of the massacre of the innocents being what it is that the angel is warning them about, what Herod is going to do to the Jewish infants trying to find the one who is the baby that we are seeing. So then I think that the painters would absolutely have assumed that we can make those connections. So you can see that there's so many areas of connection you can make. In terms of the city in the background being where they have come from, that's kind of interesting because the question, I guess, is how did they get there? If we trust merely what the painters are giving us, which is we have these 2 individuals on their donkeys moving from left to right in this horizontal roadway, how is that area connected to our distant city? So I would say if I thought that that city was their point of origin, I might have expected to find it on the left-hand side of the composition, sort of clearly leading our eyes. So that's where they were from. Here's where they are now, and maybe a little bit of sense of where they're going. The fact that it is so clearly divided from them by a body of water, that if anything, it would seem that the road they're following to the right might lead us first to this little hamlet, and then maybe sort of going around to almost like a peninsula. I mean, it kind of leaves it, again, as we said, very ambiguous. Is that purposeful on the part of the artist? I mean, it has to be, right? In the sense that it gives us something to talk about. They're not spelling it out quite so obviously as I'm going to go back 1 slide to the comparison with the Carpaccio. And because I'm reminding myself, well, in this case, there's maybe in the back left-hand side, maybe that's where they've come from, but there's really no sense there of where they're going. There's only the journey, which is its own kind of charm, I would say. Not giving you worried about where they've come from. There is a mountain in the background, where they've come from or where they're going, but focusing you on the journey, on the interaction between the 3 people. But the Dossi brothers clearly want us to think about the setting. So that's a great set of observations. Leah asked, maybe the path is blocked because it's a toll road or a bridge. And that's a great observation. And that's exactly what someone had said downstairs when she wondered that extra path that she thought she was seeing. And I apologize if this is anything that got cut off during our technological difficulty, but just to quickly reiterate, someone in our in-person group said it seemed that there might be in the undergrowth just above where we're seeing that that blocked area. Maybe it looks like there's a path carved through the undergrowth that would bring you more directly to that hamlet in the middle ground. And she said, perhaps this is where people turn off before this blocked area and you just kind of make your way sort of off-roading. And we immediately joked like, well, maybe if people don't want to pay the toll, that's just the side exit that people might take. Christy comments, there doesn't seem to be a shadow for whatever is blocking it. Well, this is a great observation. And again, one that we were debating together downstairs. And one eagle-eyed visitor, I will confess, I had not paid that much attention for the shadowing. She wondered if you can see a slight triangular shadow on the ground, and could that be cast by whatever is blocking the way? But that's definitely a case where my comment to them was, the Dossi brothers could have made this a lot easier on us, right? I mean, just imagine how easy it would be if they just changed the angle at which we see whatever this obstruction is. We would be much more readily able to understand what it is we're looking at. And they've chosen not to do that. So clearly they've wanted us to be lightly frustrated by what we do see and by what we don't see. Jane comments, I'm also thinking that the roadblock indicates the way Satan tried to repeatedly prevent the birth of Christ, and once he was born, indwelt in Herod to begin the killing of all babies aged 2 and under in another attempt. So connecting there to what Frank had observed under the phrase that we might commonly refer to that event in the biblical narrative, the massacre of the innocents. So again, I absolutely think that the more you can bring to a painting like this, the more connections that you can draw out. And Marka asks, is it unusual to show furthest away landscape in white rather than blue? Oh, that's a great question. So if you're familiar with the concept of atmospheric or aerial perspective, it refers to something that artists learn by observing, that you yourself can observe. For example, where I am in Bellarmine Hall at Fairfield University, we are on a very high point looking out over Long Island Sound. And depending on the conditions, you see Long Island Sound, you see Long Island, and then it's sort of blue. There's sort of a little haze. And the further away it is, the more bluey haze that you're seeing. And that's just because of the, where light is being reflected versus being absorbed in the distance. Artists might not have known the scientific reason for it, but they could see that it was an optical reality, something that your eyes would see. Things that are further away along the horizon are this bluish color. And you see that reproduced time and again in Renaissance art as a way of indicating distance. Here, we do see perhaps along what would be the horizon line behind the city, maybe we're seeing distant mountain ranges that have been sort of blued out. But if I go back one slide to that Carpaccio, he's not doing it to a terrible extent, except the fact that the mountain in his painting is very blue. So giving you that little bit of a sense of, it's not as hazy as you might expect, which is the more common way of doing blue and hazy. But that might be what he's doing. In terms of the white that is striking the city and the mountaintop area, there I think what might be implied is that we're seeing some sort of break in the tempest. And you can make any number of associations of what that means. What is the city? Where is the light coming from? Certainly we can't see the light. And it seems that the sky is all darkness. And yet, doesn't it seem like there must be strong, sort of slanting sun that is lighting up with this brilliance of the white light? One last thing that I wanted to share, if any of you play the game Artle, Artle, it's sponsored by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's similar to Wordle. Every day they give you 4 chances to identify an artist with 4 objects in their collection. It's a little challenging to recommend because you do have to generate the artist's name. You have to type it into a drop-down box, and it will give you some suggestions, but you have to have some names sort of in your pocket to think that it might be. And just last week, there was a painting that had, I'll just go back to where we can see them more closely. It was a painting that had a sort of mountaintop that was painted sort of white, and it had little figures that looked like they had turbans. And I had no idea what it was. I just threw out Dossi because I'd been thinking of our painting. And lo and behold, it was a painting by Dossi that had just entered the National Gallery's collection in 2021. So you can go to the National Gallery's collection database and look and see if you can find which one it might be. And I just guessed on the association, but are we surprised that an artist might repeat something? And it was it was a depiction of Aeneas and Troy. It was not a Christian narrative at all, but it was like the artist had found something that was eye-catching, that worked, and used it in a slightly different context. So if you are an art aficionado, I recommend Artle. It can be very frustrating, but it can also be a lot of fun, and certainly introduces you to new aspects of our National Art Museum that you might not have seen otherwise. With apologies again for our brief technological disruption, thank you for joining me for today's Art in Focus. Our last Art in Focus of 2022 will be December 10th, I believe, and we'll be focusing on the plaster cast of Michelangelo's Pitti Tondo that is also part of our exhibition. So I hope you'll join us then, whether in person or here on the Quick Live. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.